So a few weeks ago, I shared how my personal burnout led me to rethink Sabbath, or the lack of Sabbath in my life. But that wasn't the full story. The full story goes back 9 years. 9 years ago, God got my attention when he gave me a biblical plague. So I was crazy busy, chronically busy, you might say. The church was growing. We were growing like 20, 30% every single year, year over year. And we had outgrown our current location. We were meeting at the conference center at the time. And I was trying to get everyone on board with moving to the school. And at the same time, I was trying to raise funds and get volunteers behind this idea of redoing this storefront on Bridge Street, what would become the Bridge, our office's outreach center. I was at the exact same time leading my first ever search for staff, adding new staff members, and all of this was while I was preaching, teaching, starting new programs, leading outreach, meeting with families new to GVF, meeting with community leaders, and meeting with those in need of counseling all at the same time. So at the time, I worked 7 days a week, 3, 4, 5 nights a week. I'd be out, and there was never a time when my phone wasn't buzzing, when emails weren't coming in, when I didn't have to put out a fire or a crisis, when someone didn't want my attention, someone wasn't asking for my attention right now. And then one day I wake up and I have boils all over my body. So I go to the doctor and I'm like, what is this? And he's like, you have shingles. If you're not familiar with it, shingles is like a biblical plague. It's boils start to break out all over your chest and back. Your nervous system gets attacked, and it has this like excruciating pain, aching and resonating throughout your body. And it literally looked like the hand of God had smacked me in the side, smote me. The doctor explained that the only reason a man of my age, I was in my 30s at the time, the only reason a man of my age, my general health, would get shingles was from too much stress, a lack of rest, living on adrenaline. And so that's when I knew something had to change, something wasn't right. So that's when I went from working 7 days a week to 6 days a week, and this kind of worked for a while, but then, 4 years ago, I had what was easily my most successful year of my life. I had won a national award. I was asked to teach at a university. I was invited to speak at one of the nation's leading seminaries. Our church grew by 30%. We were adding staff, launching outreach initiatives. Everything was multiplying at our church. Everything. I was even asked to be a leadership consultant for other churches in our region. But by the end of that year, I was so desperately tired. Not just physically tired, my soul was tired. So Jenny and I, we decided we're going to get away, like just the two of us. We dropped the kids off at the grandparents and we went to Greece. And we got to visit Athens and Corinth. And then we got to spend a few days on the island of Hydra, this little Greek isle not far by boat from Athens. And at the top of Hydra is this monastery, the Elijah Monastery, where these Greek Orthodox monks live. And I'd read about it, and I really wanted to visit. I was like, we're going there. I got to go see this. But the only way to get to that monastery at the top of Hydra was to hike for 3 hours straight uphill. So the monastery sat on top of this mountain overlooking the whole island. And I told Jenny about it, how great this would be. And she was like, that is great. You go do that while I sit on the beach. So that's what we did. I hiked, she sat on the beach. And as I hiked that day, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I'd heard of, but I'd never done before. I decided I am going to pray out my entire life to God. Like from my first memories ever until that present day, I was just going to pray them out my whole life. This is something that Christians have been doing for thousands of years. Most famously, St. Augustine did it in his Confessions. It's just praying through your life before God and allowing God to speak into that, to help you process things, to show you how he's at work in your life. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do. That's what my hike up to this monastery is going to be. So for the most part, this hike and this prayer was uneventful and or too personal to share. But what stood out to me was that when I got towards the top, towards the monastery, and I got to the years that were just preceding that time, when I got to where my life got really, really busy, when I got to my most successful years, when I achieved the most, my prayer was almost entirely devoid of joy. I experienced almost no delight and no satisfaction. Instead, quite unexpectedly to me, as I prayed through those years, I was overwhelmed with grief, hurt, loss, regret, shame. And when I stood before God, I had nothing to celebrate. When I stood before God, I was miserable, even as I was wildly succeeding. That my work as a pastor had become cursed and unholy, even as I was helping others find blessing and holiness. And so I had this realization, really for the first time in my life, that all the success was making me miserable. And the craziest part of this story is that I went back home and went right back to it. The same life. Nothing changed. Like literally nothing changed. I went right back to this being outwardly successful, inwardly miserable for another year until my life bottomed out. Now, this is my story. But unfortunately, it's not just my story. I found that many of us, most of us, are somewhere on the same journey. You've seen signs in your life that the hand of God is pointing out something's not right. Pay attention to this, pay attention to this. And maybe you've even tweaked your life a little, or maybe you're a little further along in your journey and you've begun to realize, hey, the way I'm doing this isn't working. Like the way I'm living isn't leading me to a deep, rich fullness of life. It's making me miserable. But like me, you either didn't know, you don't know what to do, or you don't have the will to actually change anything. You're still living in it. And then there's those of us who've completely bottomed out. And this is a beautiful and a terrifying place to be. Like, you know you have to give up the way you're doing life. You know it's not working. Like, who you thought you were, you have to give that up. You have to walk away from that. But you don't yet know what it looks like to be on the other side. You don't yet know who you are. And this leads to this crisis of identity, faith, relationships, expectations. Life itself is up in the air, is being redefined. Now today, I am under no illusion that you're going to listen to this sermon and be like, boom, everything's changed. I will now live a deep, rich fullness of life. That's not how it works. It's a journey. We're all on it. But I am hoping that you're not as stubborn as me. I'm hoping that you can learn from me. That either way, I can't change you, but I can point you to the one who can. I can point you in the right direction. I can help you see where you're at in this journey and hopefully help you take the next step. And that's how I want to finish up this series on Sabbath. I want this to be a practical guide to finding real rest, to finding those promises of Sabbath, not just learning about Sabbath, but experiencing it, living it. So how do we move? Here's the big question for today. How do we move from learning about Sabbath, just the facts about it, the biblical facts, knowing that Sabbath is good and we should do it? How do we move from just learning about Sabbath to walking in the rest, the freedom, the delight promised in Sabbath? How do we move from knowing the biblical facts to knowing personally, experientially, tasting and seeing the rest, the delight, the contentment, the gratitude that's promised, baked in to Sabbath? So let's start today where we began this series. We're going to start in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. If you have a text, go ahead and turn there. And while you're looking for that, let's go back and review our story one last time. So Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created day 1, day 2, day 3, and each day he said, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And then in 6 days he completed his work, and then on the 7th day he rests, and he looks back over all of creation, and he said, it's tov, tov, it is good, good. And here, before Adam and Eve had ever done anything to enjoy, to earn rest, done anything to produce, have produced anything or done anything in life, God invites them to rest, to join him, to be with him, to delight in him and his good creation. That's how the story begins. But if you read the story, if you've read it, if you remember, the very next chapter, things fall apart. And by the time we pick up the story in the book of Exodus, God's people are now enslaved to Pharaoh, the god of this world. And in Pharaoh's world, you are what you produce. In Pharaoh's world, there is no rest, no relationship, no delight. It's a world of commodity, of time is money. You are defined by impersonal things, what you own, what you do, what you know, what you achieve, what you experience. People are projects, obstacles, workers, consumers. God's people are enslaved to this system, this depersonalizing, soul-destroying, freedom-stealing system. But God won't stand for it. In 10 spectacular plagues, he goes in, defeats the gods of this world, and overthrows them, kills them ritually, dramatically, shows that they have no real power or authority, and then he invites his people into relationship with him, this new way of life, a life called covenant, not commodity, but a life of covenant. And covenant is what forms a family. It's what makes a man and a woman become one. It's what allows a family to see an orphan out there and adopt them, make them their own. It gives you a sense of home, of place, of belonging. It's the establishment of faithfulness and love and relationship. God invites them into that and takes them to this place called Mount Sinai. And there, now they've established a covenant relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people. God gives them the 10 Commandments. Not a way to be saved, they're already saved. Not a way to be loved by God, he's already declared his love for them. It's the way to the deep, rich fullness of life where you are no longer a slave, but the life of a child of God. And at the heart of these commandments sits Sabbath, a space in which all the other commandments, love for God, love for others, can grow and flourish. So now we fast forward 1,500 years to ancient Palestine, and this wandering teacher, this rabbi, he's out there overlooking this crowd of people, this man from Nazareth, and he declares, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. So the question is, how do we enter into that? How do we walk in that? And the answer seems to be just one chapter over in Matthew chapter 12. So this is the very end of Matthew chapter 11. Jesus makes this beautiful invitation. And then Matthew chapter 12, we read. Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath commandment, the fourth commandment of the 10 Commandments, simply says, do not work. Seems clear enough. Don't work. Don't live in Pharaoh's world where you feel like you're only worth what you produce or you're only good if you do something. That's it. Don't do that. So by this standard, let's be clear, the disciples are not technically working. They're in a grain field. They're like ripping off some heads of grain, snacking. That's not work. But the question is when you have this commandment, do not work, what happens when someone does break it? What happens when someone tests what work means? So we read this story early on in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 15. This guy, he goes out on a Sabbath and he starts picking up some wood on Sabbath. And some people see him and they're like, Moses, what do we do? The guy's picking up firewood. It said, don't work. And there he is. He's working. And Moses goes to the Lord, the tent of meeting, and says, Lord, what are we supposed to do? This man, he's picking up firewood on the Sabbath. Should we fine him? Should we force him to clean the latrines or something, beat him around? And the Lord says, get this, stone him. Treat him the way you would a murderer, a rapist, a terrorist. Stone him. God seems to think that it's better for his people to die than to live without Sabbath. So for obvious reasons, from the Old Testament on, the Jewish leaders and religious leaders decide to take this whole not working thing really, really seriously. So they do, rather than keep it up for grabs and let you define what work means to you in your heart of hearts, they do what's called putting a fence around the law. So this is what Eve did in the Garden of Eden. God said very clearly, do not eat of the tree. That tree, don't eat of it. But when Eve recites the law, she actually says, we're not even supposed to touch it. And I guess the logic is that if you don't touch the tree, you can't be tempted to eat from it. That's the idea. But if you know the story, this whole putting a fence around the law thing didn't work out so well for Eve. Regardless, that's what the ancient rabbis did to basically all the laws of the Old Testament, especially this one. So they took this law that just said do not work, and they actually put a fence around it. They had 39 prohibitions. This is spelled out in the Mishnah, like Orthodox Jews to this day follow this. It includes things like planting, reaping, spinning, shearing, weaving, writing, untying, tearing. So we talked about this a few weeks back. This is why if you go to like a kibbutz in Israel today, they have pre-torn toilet paper. Because on Sabbath, tearing is considered work. You're not allowed to tear. So you have to have pre-torn toilet paper. Now, according to these rules, Jesus' disciples are clearly in the wrong. But what's Jesus going to say? Look at verse 3. He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered into the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests." So he pulls out like this relatively obscure story about David from 1 Samuel chapter 21. And he says, hey, do you remember that time when David went to the house of God? So house of God was the tabernacle at the time, later replaced by the temple. And what would happen is on the Sabbath day, the priest would come in to the house of God, and they would lay on the table of showbread, they would lay these loaves of bread, unleavened bread, and that this bread was to be presented before the Lord, and it was to represent in an act of worship, like their praise for the way God provided their daily bread in the wilderness and provided their daily bread in life. So every Sabbath they would put that bread on, and then every Sabbath they would come in, they would take the old bread out, put the fresh bread on. It appears that David shows up, presumably on a Sabbath, and he eats that bread. But here's the thing, according to the law, that bread was only to be eaten by priests. So David's breaking all kinds of rules here. What's Jesus' point? David broke the rule, and God didn't condemn him. In fact, God doesn't say anything about it. So do you see what Jesus is doing here? He doesn't address their system of 39 rules, doesn't even talk about it. He doesn't try and justify the behavior of his disciples, doesn't even talk about it. He doesn't try and justify what David did. He doesn't say those old laws are abolished, they're old, they're gone, forget about them. He doesn't do that either. Rather, at least in this situation, he points out that God seems to be more concerned about David than about the Sabbath bread eating rules. He suggests that maybe the way they're understanding the Sabbath as a list of do's and don'ts isn't quite the way God sees Sabbath. That maybe the way they've depersonalized Sabbath and turned it into 39 technical rules, maybe that's not the best approach. So he follows it up with this. Or haven't you read in the law that the priest on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? He says the Sabbath cannot be flattened out and reduced to just a simple list of technical do's and don'ts, of rules. And how do we know that? He says the priest. Like priestly work, it doesn't stop on Sabbath. Are the priests breaking the Sabbath? Yes, they're desecrating it. But no, they're innocent of breaking the Sabbath. Why? And he explains in verse 6. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. So there's a hierarchy. Get this. The lesser thing serves the greater thing. So serving in the temple is greater than the Sabbath. The Sabbath serves to draw people to God in the temple. So we're not going to limit the temple in order to serve the Sabbath. No, the Sabbath serves the temple. You get it? That the Sabbath serves the temple. The temple is greater than the Sabbath. And then Jesus adds here, and I'm greater than the temple. So the temple is greater than the Sabbath, and Jesus is greater than the temple. That the Sabbath should serve the temple, and the temple should serve Jesus. The point of Sabbath is not to get people to follow 39 rules of not working. The point of Sabbath is to get people to love me, he says. And not just love me, to love one another. Look at verse 7. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, quoting Hosea there, you would not have condemned the innocent. So he's quoting this line from the prophet Hosea. So at the time of Hosea, it was a time when God's people were perfectly performing their religious rituals. Like they were going to temple, saying their prayers, offering just the right sacrifices, and at the same time, abusing the poor, hating foreigners, and worshiping the gods of this world. At the same time. So God says to his people in the book of Hosea, if you're going to worship me in this empty rituals that doesn't change how you love me or love others, if you're going to technically follow all the rules but not love me, not love your neighbor, I'd rather you not do it at all. Just stop it. And here Jesus picks that up and says, if the only thing you get out of Sabbath is a list of 39 prohibitions, if that's all it is to you, a list of do's and don'ts, it would be better for you to just stop practicing Sabbath entirely, because you've completely missed the point. Verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. See, the Sabbath, he says, is about me. All of it, from first to last, it's about me. He says, I was there at creation calling you to join my Father in delight. I was the one who saved you out of slavery. I was the one who loved you when you were still broken, when you'd done nothing to earn my love. I was the one who called you to be a child of God. I was the one who led you, at times carried you through the wilderness, through those dry times of life. I was the one who provided your daily bread. I was the one who gave you rest, who called you to rest, who is inviting you to rest. Not just a day off from work, not just an empty ritual, not a set of rules, but rest for your soul. Rest from having to create and sustain your own identity. Rest from having to earn love or meaning or value. Rest from fear, insecurity, anxiety. Rest from the gods of achievement, consumerism, competition, performance, entertainment. Jesus says, I am the Lord of Sabbath, of that deep rest, that delight, that contentment, that gratitude that you were created for. So apart from Jesus, follow this logic, apart from Jesus, Sabbath is nothing. In fact, it's less than nothing. It's ridiculous. It's like a single person practicing a weekly date night by themselves. Like, you've kind of missed the point. Because Sabbath is not about forcing people to practice a ritual or follow some rules. Sabbath is about inviting people to let go of striving. Let go of achieving and worrying and numbing and proving yourself and trying to control everything so that you can receive what you could never earn. The gift of life with God. So Sabbath is where you experience a love that cannot be earned, only received. A delight that cannot be produced, only surrendered to. A freedom that cannot be taken, only given. A forgiveness that cannot be achieved, only accepted. That is the invitation of Sabbath. So the question that might be brewing in some of your minds is, if this is the real meaning of the Sabbath, I would suggest that it is. It's about Jesus and not some rules. Then why, you may ask, in the Old Testament, does God kill some guy for breaking the law? And here's all I can say. God seems to think that it's better to die than to live a life without Sabbath. That if we never stop depending on ourselves, if we never stop serving the gods of this world, if we never stop to delight in Him, to delight in creation, to receive the gift that is life, something will happen to us that is worse than being stoned to death. We will live, but not really live. We'll work, but never enjoy what we've accomplished. We'll eat, but never taste our food. We'll show up, but never be fully present. We'll create and strive and produce, but never delight in it. We'll become so busy that we'll forget what life is really about. And this is a cursed and unholy existence. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17. So King Solomon, he desperately tries to make his life meaningful by what he does and creates and produces and experiences. If you know the story, like, he does everything. He outdoes us in every way, shape, and form. And when he gets to the very top of that ladder, when he's achieved his every life goal and owns everything he could ever want and slept with every woman he's ever desired and tasted every food he's ever wanted to try, when he's done everything, owns everything, knows everything, what's he say? So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me, all of it meaningless, a chasing after the wind. But get this, over this message, Jesus cries out, "Come to me, you who are weary, you who are burdened. You don't have to live like that. Come with me. Get away with me. I will show you the way to a new way of life. I will give you rest." Church, listen to me. You don't have to live a miserable life. You don't have to hate your life. You don't have to serve the gods of the world or live like this. But you do have to stop. You have to cease. You have to Sabbath. You have to stop trying to figure your own way out of this. You have to stop thinking that happiness is on the other side of more. You have to stop working, achieving, numbing, being chronically busy. You have to Sabbath and trust Jesus to give you what you can't earn. So, how do we move from learning about Sabbath to walking in Jesus' invitation to find that rest of those promises of the Sabbath? That's how. You have to practice Sabbath, not just the rules and rituals, but the act of setting aside space in your week where you stop and trust Jesus with your worries and delight, with your sins and your success, with your identity and meaning, that we have to stop trying to grab it for ourselves and receive what we can never earn on our own. Now, some of you are sitting there, and I've heard this throughout the series. I just want to address this today. Some of you are sitting there and saying, "Anderson, I've been waiting this whole time, and finally we get to the New Testament, and you're just kidding me here. This is so Old Testament. Do you want us to wear yarmulkes and start slaughtering sheep as well? This just feels like Sabbath is an Old Testament law." That you would say to me, listen, you listen to what you just preached. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. We're no longer bound by Sabbath laws, right? So Colossians 2:16, "Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink with regard to a religious festival or a new moon celebration or a Sabbath day." Doesn't the Apostle Paul say that because of Jesus Christ, we don't have to obey the Sabbath? Our faith is not defined by rules or special days. For those who believe in Jesus, every day is holy and blessed. Every day is set apart for God. Hebrews chapter 4. Every day we can rest in the finished work of Jesus Christ. That when he died on the cross, he said, "It is finished." That means all of our work is finished. Therefore, every single day we can enjoy that rest by faith. To which, if you told me that, I would say, "Yes, I'm so glad you're reading your Bible." Seriously, bravo. Do that more. Because you are absolutely right. We are not under law. There are no threats made against us if we don't practice Sabbath. We are under grace. If you don't take a day off and delight in God, God is not going to kill you. You're going to kill yourself. It's so much better. Stress, high blood pressure, trouble breathing, anxiety, depression, compulsive eating, inability to focus, heart attacks, and my personal favorite, shingles. These are just a few of the obvious symptoms of a life without Sabbath. This is what a lifetime of chronic busyness does to us physically and emotionally. Can you imagine what it does to our souls? So we don't practice Sabbath because Jesus needs us to or forces us to. We practice Sabbath because we desperately need Jesus. We don't practice it because Jesus desperately needs us to do that. We practice it because we desperately need Jesus. Jesus says it this way. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The Sabbath is a gift. Sabbath is not meant to constrain your life. It's meant to set you free. Free from thinking you have to achieve God's favor. Free from thinking your value comes from how much money you make or how much you know or how many people you influence. Sabbath is a gift. Jesus is saying, "Come here, just enjoy this. Relish this with me. Delight with me. Enjoy this." The Sabbath is not ultimately about a day or about rituals or about rules. It's about a person, and his name is Jesus. So if a life of chronic busyness gives you more of Jesus, then by all means, you go do that. But as for me and my house, we need Sabbath. So, how do we move from learning about Sabbath to walking in the rest, freedom, delight promised in Sabbath? How do we do this? I can't tell you how to do this, but I can guide you. I can point you in the right direction. This is not something that I can teach you in a sermon. It's not something that you learn or you can download on an MP3. It's something you have to experience. It's a path you have to walk. It's a journey you have to choose to go on. You find rest by following Jesus, by actually doing it, not just reading about it, not just listening about it. So here's my challenge. Wherever you're at in your journey with God, you might not even know what it means to follow Jesus yet. You might even not be sure, but I'm inviting you. No worries. This invitation is for you. Every single person who's listening to this, you're invited into this. Here it goes. I want to invite you, every single person at GVF, everyone listening to this, to practice Sabbath for the next 4 weeks. Now, I would like to make it longer, but let's be realistic here. I want this to be an experiment. I want it to be realistic, some bite size that we can try. 4 weeks. So in the sermon description, both in the sermon description and on our website, we're going to link with this a Sabbath worksheet. Looks something like this, and it's going to give you a step-by-step, a practical guide to finding real rest of how you plan it out. I just want to talk you through this as you think about personally, like how am I going to move from head knowledge to experiencing this Sabbath that Jesus invites me into? I'm going to walk through this with the rest of the sermon here today. The first thing is this. Very, very simple. Pick a time/day. When you practice the Sabbath, when will that be? Be specific. What day? From what time to what time? So you might be asking, does it have to be a Sunday? And the answer is no. I mean, historically, traditionally, Christians have practiced the Sabbath on Sunday because that was the day from which Jesus rose from the dead, and it changed all of the universe. Ideally, you're going to find a time when you can practice Sabbath with others, especially close friends, family, and Sunday is usually the best. But some of us, myself, I'm busy on Sunday. Can't practice it then. So practice it on a day when you can. The second question is this. What if you can't possibly give up 24 hours? That just is completely unrealistic in your life right now. That's okay. Here's the question. What can you give to the Lord? Start there. Can you commit 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours? Start there. When I was in college, I went on this missions trip to Virginia Beach, and we worked full-time, did ministry full-time. We didn't have time to take one whole day for Sabbath. So we devoted one evening a week. It was Wednesday nights, and you were not allowed to do anything productive. You were supposed to eat good food with your friends and spend time with Jesus. And some people would go pick up a guitar, and I would always go to the coffee shop because that's where Jesus is. Do what works for you, though. It doesn't have to be 24 hours, although 24 hours is where you want to get to. Next is this. Prepare for the Sabbath. So what do you need to do ahead of time in order to step away from the work, busyness, demands, pressures of the world? So you remember the Israelites, they were to gather twice as much manna the day before Sabbath. You probably need to do something like that yourself. What do you need to do? Grocery shopping, home improvement projects, food prep, clearing your inbox, turning on your autoresponder, paperwork. What is hanging over your head? What do you have to get rid of, or have to let go of, or have to put away? Otherwise, it will become a whip in the hand of the God of this world telling you to get back to work. Do that. Third, set the Sabbath apart from other times and days. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 20 say that the Sabbath is to be holy. That means it's set apart for God. So you don't plan a guy's night out on your wife's birthday. Why? Because that evening is set apart for your wife. You don't plan a work trip over Christmas Day. Why? Because that day is different. It's set apart. It's special. The Sabbath is the Lord's day. It's His. So what do you need to do to make it special, to make it set apart from other days? Traditionally, Jews actually had rituals to open and close it, like the opening of the Olympics and the closing of the Olympics, right? There was something to signify we are now entering a different time in our lives. What they would usually do to signify this is they'd have a big luxurious family dinner, and they would light 2 candles representing the 2 main imperatives of Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath and remember that you were once slaves who've been set free. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to do that, but creating some personal or family rituals might be helpful. Like rituals like that are not bad in and of themselves. They can be really good. Some families start their Sabbath by lighting candles. Some eat a special dinner. Some have a family game night. Some begin with prayer and devotionals. The ritual is not essential, but setting it apart is essential. So what do you need to do? What do you need to set up in your life to set that apart as the Lord's? Next, pursue things that grow your love for God. Remember, Sabbath is where our love for God and our love for others grows. So we talked about this a few weeks ago. Create a list of practices, spaces, people that you want to seek out in Sabbath. Things that help you delight, relish in God and creation and His goodness. Just enjoy life as gift. Now, you don't have to be wooden or legalistic about this. Let love guide you. So there's a Jewish author who writes on this, Abraham Heschel, and he says something that I think is a really helpful bit of advice. He says this: if you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. If you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. So this is something that kind of opened up my eyes. For me, I spend most of my week in books on a computer and on a phone. So for me, Sabbath a lot of times looks like building something, creating something, doing something physical like that. For you, that might look like work. So it's going to be different depending on your station of life. So on the positive, how do we pursue the things that grow our love for God? We need to seek those things, those practices, spaces, people that help us delight in God. On the negative side, we need to create a list of practices, spaces, and people that are not welcome on Sabbath. Sabbath requires you to say no to anything that threatens your freedom to truly love God. So what gods of this world do you need to mock and kill? What activities, people, technology, anything that induces numbness, anxiety, competition, do you need to disinvite from your Sabbath? They are not welcome. Again, we have to be careful here. Your list might be entirely different than mine. So for me, I might be addicted to social media and have to shut off my cell phone for the entire time. You might not find that tempting in the least. We cannot reduce Sabbath to a list of rules, but love for God demands that we don't welcome the gods of this world into our Sabbath. We have to bar them. So pursue the things that grow your love for God, but also pursue the things that grow your love for others. We talked about this last week. Ask God to show you those who are hurting, in need, physically, emotionally, spiritually, those who are unloved. Treat them the way God has treated you. So Sabbath is not merely a personal discipline. It's a call to cross boundaries, to open your home to those who are not like you, to go after those who are far from God, to unconditionally love those who have never experienced unconditional love. So this might look like acts of hospitality, visitation, evangelism, simple acts of kindness. That practicing Sabbath doesn't look like not doing anything, doing good works, loving other people. That is not work. That is the type of thing you're supposed to do on Sabbath. So that's the positive. And the negative that we haven't talked about yet, sometime I'm going to cover in a whole sermon, is that we should also ask God to show us how our selfish desires, how personal luxuries get in the way of loving others. And on Sabbath, we're here to give those up. If you want a text for this, spend some time in Amos 4 and 5, and you will see a colorful description of how personal luxuries get in the way of loving others. So, and the last point, remember. Deuteronomy chapter 5:15. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. God gives us Sabbath to remember. You were a slave, but because of His great love for you, you're set free. That while you were yet a sinner, Christ died for you. That you don't have to live in slavery anymore. You're a child of God. So what will help you remember? Not just intellectually, but experientially, emotionally, vividly, that you are no longer a slave to the God of this world, but you are a child of God. Are there books, songs, practices, people that you need in your life to help you remember, not just intellectually, but experience who you really are, who God is, the freedom that you're called to live in. Now, going to church is a good start there. Our songs, prayers, readings, confessions, sermons, and communion table are designed to help you remember who God is, who you are, and what He has done. So preparing your heart to receive this can help you experience it on Sabbath. That's the idea. Let's close where we started this series. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. That is the invitation for you today. Let's take Him up on it. Let's walk in it.